Hello, everyone. Before I start, I just want to thank the organizers for all their hard work in organizing this conference. And I also want to acknowledge the communities whose languages that I'm going to be discussing here. These are your languages, and I've been very happy to learn more about them through this. My name is James Tandy. I'll be talking about the topic of evaluating the Mayan perfect suffix bil as a lowland areal diffusion. The background on this, there's a perfect participle suffix bil in many Mayan languages that represents perfect aspect. Kaufman reconstructs it to proto-Mayan. And by the way, I'm going to be referring to this as Kaufman's model throughout, though I'm aware that mostly this is because he's the main one who's written about it, but I'm aware that the source I'm citing here is a working paper, so it may not be the final word on what he thinks. But he reconstructs bil to proto-Mayan. I argue that bil was a lowland diffusion, and instead I reconstruct val m as the perfect participle. I'm going to be using evidence from distribution, a little bit of internal reconstruction, and also what I'm going to call the inevitability of contact, just that in whatever scenario you pick, there has to be contact involved in some way. So assuming sort of the standard subgrouping according to Kaufman, I'm going to be just assuming Huastec split off first, then Yucatecan, and then you have an Eastern-Western Mayan split. I think many of you will be familiar with this model, and I'm also going to be drawing from prior work on the lowland contact area. This is referring to the heavy influence that there has been among Cholan, Saltalan, and Yucatecan languages, with additional influence on Conhobalan, Huastecan, and some Quichean languages that have participated in this region. I'm going to be arguing that bil was part of this. So the basic facts: all Mayan languages express perfect aspect in some way. It's always as a suffix, which is a little bit odd for aspect, which is usually marked as a prefix, a proclitic, or in some languages, a particle. I'm focusing here on transitive verbs, so the intransitive perfect aspect suffix just doesn't enter into this. In some languages, the perfect aspect of transitive verbs takes a different suffix in active and passive voice. Kaufman refers to these as perfect status versus perfect participle. I'm going to be just calling them the active and passive perfect, but I will throw in the term perfect participle for the passive form every now and then. But a language where they're different, Yucatecan languages are like this. So in Itzhak, we have utzamach, he or she has given, with the M compared to chekbil, it has been cut, using bil. This contrasts with languages like Quiche that have val m in both active and passive voice. So active voice, at nuch ayom, I have hit you. Passive voice, e mok-oom, they have been buried. Both use the om suffix. So the question that I'm addressing here is which one of these scenarios reconstructs? Kaufman's hypothesis is that val m was used in the active voice, bil in the passive. Like Yucatecan, hypothesis 2 is that you have val m in both active and passive voice, more like Quichean and also Huastecan. So one thing I'll mention is that val m as the active voice perfect is assumed in both models. This isn't controversial because Huastecan has this, Quichean has this, and Yucatecan has this. And so it probably reconstructs. There's also not really an alternative reconstruction for this. Saltalan has och for the active perfect, but that should be a short vowel, I'm sorry. But this is innovative, and it's pretty clear that om reconstructs with this function. So the real question is whether it was also the passive perfect suffix or if bil had this role. I also won't be discussing suffixes that have a more limited distribution and seem like they're more clearly innovative, like val el, mach, and och, which appear in some Mayan languages, but have a fairly limited distribution, and it doesn't look like they reconstruct. I can justify that questions if necessary, but I'm going to move on. So the case for Beal, there actually seems to be a good sort of on the surface case for Beal in that it's just very, very widespread, arguably the most widespread perfect suffix. 15 out of 31 or 32 Mayan languages have Beal as the perfect participle. 17 if you include Baal, which is present in Mocho and Tofalabal and may or may not be cognate. It's also present in multiple subgroups from all across the family, from Yucatec to Cholan Saltalan, Conhobalan, and Kekchi and Quichean also has it. So sort of your default, assuming the standard subgrouping, which has been established for other reasons, this looks like a shared retention. But despite this, I think that Beal is an innovation that spread through contact. And I argue for the model where val M was both the active and passive perfect. So I'm going to be arguing from distribution, from internal evidence, from the complexity of the reflexes of M. I'm going to suggest an origin for Beal and show, like I said, the inevitability of contact in any scenario. Starting with distribution, this is the map for reflexes of Beal. This is a very wide area. A lot of it's accounted for by Cholan and Yucatecan. It covers a wide area, but I'll note that with the exception of Mocho, everything on this map is a language that has at least one other lowland innovation. Contrast this with the map for val M. This looks like a much more limited distribution, but so this includes all of Eastern Mayan. It includes what I'm arguing is a reflex in Conhobal. It also includes Huastec, which is off the map. So even though Beal is fairly widespread, it's in a contiguous region that's consistent with lowland contact, whereas the passive uses of val M, by the way, I should have said this refers to the passive uses of val M, not the, so doesn't include Yucatecan, which has the active voice M. The passive val M is present in both Eastern Mayan and Huastec. There's not really any possibility that this was a shared innovation due to contact because they're at opposite ends of the region. So if you assume that Beal was the original passive participle, then the active voice perfect val M had to have been extended to passive voice in these languages independently. So Huastec has val M for active and passive. Quiche has val M for active and passive. If you assume that this is an innovation, it had to have happened twice. So another distribution here that doesn't quite fit with it being only an innovation in Eastern Mayan and Huastec. Conhobal has what looks like a passive val M reflex coming from the perfect. So there's this verbal passive om, which Mateo Toledo 1998 notes. This is very possibly a relic feature. I haven't seen it reported on in any other Conhobal variety. And it seems like it has to have come from an om perfect just because there aren't any other suffixes that I know of that would be a likely source. So with regard to internal evidence though, how plausible are these kinds of changes? So again, assuming a passive Beal reconstruction, val M has to have extended from active to passive in Huastec and in Eastern Mayan. So is this plausible though? I'm arguing that in most Mayan languages, the passive perfect is actually the more basic form and the active perfect is based on it. So all Mayan languages have a passive perfect participle, but not all Mayan languages have an active voice perfect. Conhobal and Popti don't have an active voice perfect as far as I know. Mamian and Cholan languages also, from grammatical descriptions, they only give the passive form. Where there is a clear difference, it almost looks like the active perfect is synchronically based on the passive perfect, by way of being this sort of possessed patient noun. So in Quiche, om can be the perfect tense. It can also be what looks like a patient nominalization. So mok-oom is something like one whose services have been asked for. It can mean servant. It's this nominalization of the patient of the action. You can possess that, nu mok-oom, my servant, my one who I've asked for the services of. Now compare then the perfect use of this, at nuchayom, meaning I have hit you, with a possessed, like something that's clearly a possessed noun, like at nukahol, you are my son. Larson suggests an alternative reading for the perfect here, that at nuchayom could actually be more like literally, you are my one who has been hit, chayom being this patient nominalization. So in this case, the active would be based on this passive form. So more evidence of a similar process happening. In pokom, I would argue is from a nominalization och. All varieties of pokom use it as a passive perfect participle, but in some varieties from 1700s and 1800s, there's evidence of a very similar construction to what's going on with om and quiche. So och rubanoch Dios, translated as we are the creation of God, can also, like, it's a very short step from there to God has created us. And this is identical in form to the quiche example with om. Similarly, in 1888, Stoll reported nuch abuch as meaning either it is my shot, abuch being this nominalized thing that has been shot, or I have shot it, with this perfect reading. So similarly, Yucateco has extended Beal from passive to active. Under any scenario, Beal was originally passive. Yucateco extended it to active. So in summary, Eastern Mayan and Huastec ended up with the passive perfect vowel M, but instead of the generalization you'd have to make if this was an innovation, it seems like the active perfect is based on the passive perfect, wherever there is a difference that we can see. And so I would argue that even in proto-Mayan, the active perfect vowel M was probably synchronically based on the passive vowel M and not the reverse. This would be consistent with the patterns we see. With regard to complexity of reflexes, there are a lot of different reflexes that can be traced to the perfect vowel M. I am only giving the passive reflexes here, not the active ones. So quiche has om as the perfect participle. Kachikel, the reflex is on with a sound change, similar in Mamian, vowel glottal N. Other Quichean languages innovated mach. Huastec has amech, it added a suffix to it. Ixil has mal, which is a slightly different form, sort of this resultative. And then Uspanteco and Kwanhobal use reflexes as verbal passives. This variety sort of suggests that it's an older suffix. If you compare that to Beal, it's pretty much just Beal across the board, and it's always the perfect participle. Chorti, there was a fairly recent regular sound change, changing it to Bir, L to R. And in Mocho and Toholabal, they have Bal with the same function. I'm not entirely convinced it's cognate, but it probably is. But those are about the extent of the differences you get. Other languages do have a suffix Beal or Bal as an instrument nominalization, but it's not entirely clear that these are cognate, even less so than the Bal in Mocho and Tokolabal. So the fact that these are relatively similar almost is a case for them being a more recent spread. As far as what the actual origin of Beal would be, there's not much to say here, more because there are too many sources that could be possible. Beal looks morphologically complex because there are a number of suffixes that have a B, and there are a number of vowel L suffixes that would be nominalizations that would tend to derive this perfect participle patient nominal use. Kaufman even suggests one such derivation, even though he says the suffix reconstructs. So sort of regardless of what stage, there is some plausible origin for it, but the fact that you can split it apart this way kind of makes a more recent origin plausible. And lastly, inevitability of contact. My scenario sort of implies that Beal was innovated and spread through contact. That's the only way to explain how it ended up in so many different subgroups. Borrowing an affix so directly in this way and in so widespread of an area is really typologically strange. It's not common to borrow tense aspect markers, and it's not common to borrow derivational affixes without loanwords. But you kind of can't get away from this. Any scenario you posit, there has to be some contact. So in my hypothesis, like I said, Beal was innovated somewhere in the lowlands and spread to the rest of the lowlands. In Kaufman's scenario, where Beal is the original perfect participle, he says that vowel M was innovated in Eastern Mayan. So okay, every Eastern Mayan language has vowel M, except for Kekchi. Kekchi has Beal. And so I would think, and he says this is a possibility, that Kekchi reborrowed Beal from Cholon. So even then, you have to argue that Beal was borrowed at least once. And an even more unlikely scenario, well, okay, what if you say that Kekchi Beal is actually a retention and vowel M was an innovation that excluded Kekchi? Then you have to say that vowel M spread to all of the Quichean and Mayan languages by contact, because Kekchi is the only one that's excluded, so Quichean and Mayan had to have already split by that point. So no matter what you do, like, you could come up with even more different theories, but all of them would involve having to posit contact in some way. So in conclusion, I've given my case that vowel M was both the active and the passive perfect in Proto-Mayan. Beal was probably a recent innovation that spread through contact. It's got a similar distribution to Lowland features, though again, not perfect overlap. It seems to be the best model. And I welcome plenty of further comments on this, and I'm happy to see what questions people come up with. Here are my references. I only cited specific examples, or I gave a citation for specific examples I cited, but I am happy to provide the full list of works cited for this project. And so thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to seeing the questions that people have in the question and answer period.